Mr. Chairman, Professor James, our most gracious hosts and hostesses, scholars, fellow students, and members of the public, I am delighted to be part of this conference. I will briefly consider with you certain facets of the labor movement in Trinidad and Tobago during the Williams regime and his response. Williams's earliest exposure to the awesome struggles of the laboring class must have come to him at Oxford University in his research on slavery. The intellectual journey of the young Williams took him through the dark caverns of West Indian slavery as he analyzed the horrible exploitation of slavery. He gave a new perspective to labor history in the colonial era, which focused on metropolitan objectives, fueled by an excessive greed, which enriched Europe, but ravished human and natural resources in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. After some disappointment at the Anglo-Caribbean Commission, Williams had one final assignment before he let his bucket down at Woodford Square to leave it there for 25 years. That brief assignment, prior to his political career, took him to Europe from the 9th of October to the 18th of December 1955 as advisor to one of the world's most celebrated labor organizations, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. In Europe in 1955, his official portfolio was advisor to the Confederation. Other responsibilities included the consultative status with the International Labor Organization, the ILO. I found some letters of Williams, who he wrote to friends in Trinidad with reference to his ILO experiences. These are housed at the University of the West Indies Library. These letters indicate that the Trade Union Federation was impressed with the work of Williams and further offered him the assignment of presenting a report to its executive board in Geneva. He was advised that depending on the quality of his report, it would be presented at a higher level at another ILO conference. Williams traveled to Geneva in November 1955 and held discussions with ILO officials regarding another assignment at the Trade Union Confederation. Two pamphlets were produced: International Standards on Plantation Workers, and secondly, the ICFTU and the Plantation Workers. His knowledge and critical assessment of the world of labor resulted in the onerous responsibilities of speaking at these international conferences. He was admired and respected by trade unionists, labor leaders, and policymakers. But his contribution in this sphere of labor was to be abruptly ended. The decision of this new but competent labor analyst to become involved in the party politics of Trinidad and Tobago was definitely a major loss to the labor movement in the world. Upon his return to Trinidad, Williams was valued both as a speaker and advisor for the local unions, his first being the Sugar Workers Union. I now turn to Williams's public life in Trinidad and Tobago. When he launched his career in 1955, he presented a series of lectures between 1955 and 1962. Williams persisted in his demand for self-government for Trinidad and Tobago. He finally received the Independence Charter at Marlborough House, London, in June 1962. But how was it won? He fought no battle at Marlborough House. Indeed, his only opponent was not the Secretary of State for the Colonies, but Dr. Rudranath Kapildev, leader of the opposition party, the DLP. Williams later proudly asserted that his first real achievement of the government was the abolition of the Crown colony system. I respectfully submit that the real heroes of the independence, the true soldiers of the movement, The precursors of independence and the true pioneers of nationalism were the colonies' labor leaders. It was the Trinidad Working Men's Association from 1897 to 1932, and then subsequent union leaders who made consistent appeals and representations in Port of Spain and London for self-government. When the colony was finally granted independence in 1962, the scarred warriors belonged to an era of William Howard Bishop, Captain Arthur Andrew Cipriani, Adrian Cola Rienzi, Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler. These people laid the groundwork and procured for Williams an easy access to independence. Indeed, Williams claimed the credit for independence, and he gave some small praise to Arthur Cipriani, Butler, and Patrick Solomon. He said, "These three go down in our history as the great trinity in our movement for self-government," end of quote. He did not hesitate to also pour scorn on their efforts. Furthermore, greater insult was added to Cipriani and Butler when Williams, in History of Trinidad and Tobago, included Solomon in this list. Patrick Solomon certainly does not belong here. Scholars as W.R. Jacobs saw Buzz Butler's role in 1937, the riots, infused with a mission larger than that of protest and violent demonstration. Butler was a firm advocate for self-government. In fact, his political organization was not just a workers' party, it was a citizens' home rule party. It is no wonder that in some quarters in Trinidad and the rest of the Caribbean, the only rival to Williams for the title Father of the Nation is Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler. The labor movement prior to the 1940s fought for independence at a time when England was not prepared to grant that request, and it therefore made labor's task more onerous, more difficult, and more trying. Of course, one may add, Williams was fortunate to be on the scene when the West Indian colonies were once again no longer economically and politically useful to Britain. During the 1950s and thereafter, with the emergence of chief ministers, premiers, and prime ministers in the British West Indian territories, several of these leaders came from the ranks of the trade union movement. Trinidad and Eric Williams were the exception. Williams encouraged no political accommodation with labor. In Jamaica, there was Alexander Bustamante. He came from the Bustamante Industrial Union, and his Jamaica Labour Party formed the government. Grantley Adams of the Barbados Labour Party served as President General of the Barbados Workers' Union. And Eric Gary, he was leader of the Grenada Manual and Metal Workers' Union. Eric Williams steered clear of any political association with these unions. He understood the problems, interacting with the island's multiplicity of workers, and more significantly, he understood the dangers of courting the major unions in sugar and oil with their different ethnic bases. This was a good strategy for him to avoid political power sharing with labor, as this enabled the PNM to extend its appeal to all sectors of the society, inclusive of the growing middle class. With broad-based electoral support, he garnered his parliamentary majority in constituencies which were outside of the influence of trade unions. Indeed, it was obvious that support for Williams' PNM, particularly for electoral purposes, transcended all trade unions. Williams never had it easy with the labor movement. He began his political career greeted by incessant labor unrest. During 1960 to 1964, there were at least 230 strikes involving 75,000 workers. Williams' response to labor in this era was legislative. The centerpiece was the Industrial Stabilization Act, often known as the ISA, enacted on the 18th of March, 1965. He was uncompromising in this period of industrial anarchy. He was accused of being dictatorial. Labor leaders said he was taking them back to the early colonial days when it canceled the right of unions to strike. The unions protested the government's violation of their rights. Williams' ISA virtually crippled the unions. He threw caution to the wind and got after the labor movement. He rode a dangerous trail. The power of unions to represent the working class was now placed in the industrial court. The OWTU's, Oilfield Workers Trade Union, had a newspaper, the Vanguard. They condemned the ISA as being a bloodless takeover. For the working class, sit-downs, go-slows, strikes were now criminal activities. The OWTU challenged the legislation. The appeal court, headed by Chief Justice Sir Hugh Woodin, determined that although unions had the freedom to strike, they did not have the right to strike.